Hampshire listeners, this is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I am in sunny, well, not sunny per se, Columbus, Ohio, or thereabouts, for a day of classes and speaking things, which I'll tell you more about later, which I booked over a year ago and forgot about and didn't realize it was going to be on the New Hampshire primary. And today is New Hampshire primary day. And obviously we're recording in the morning, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we have guesses. And joining me today to talk about, really, we have no idea what, but she was willing to do it early and help me out from the road. None other than the lovely and talented Sarah Isgur. Sarah, welcome back to the Remnant.
Oh,
hello. So Dixville Notch has voted 6-0 for Nikki Haley. So we can just call this whole thing off, right? I mean, it's like the entrails of the bird have shown us what's going to happen.
I've got an important question for you because you're older than I am.
Mm-hmm. And always will be.
Yeah. Was Dixville Notch really a thing before the West Wing?
Yeah.
I don't, obviously, Dixville Notch existed and they voted at midnight, but like, did people in politics know much about Dixville Notch before the West Wing?
I think it was always one of those like 20 to 30 second segments on the NBC nightly news. And then Dixville Notch, the first votes were cast by, and then they move on to the whatever, you know?
Yeah.
And so like, if you follow politics, you'd heard of it. It was sort of a thing, but it wasn't. I think you're right that West Wing turbocharged it.
Because it's also not only Dixville Notch that votes at midnight.
Who else votes at midnight?
There's a sister city. I mean, it's not really a sister city, but there's another New Hampshire place that votes at midnight, isn't there?
I don't know. You're the cephalologist of this conversation, not me.
Yeah, what does that mean?
It's a person who studies votes. It comes from the Greek "ceph," meaning stone, because they used to cast votes. The ballots were little stones, and so it's basically stone counting.
Interesting. Okay, well, see, we've learned something.
There you go. All right. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for being here. Leave them on a high note.
With very little knowledge gained, I think we're done here. Oh, yeah. So Dixville Notch, Hart's Location, and Millsfield all vote at midnight.
So it's sort of like they're the Shelbyville to
That's right.
Dixville Notch's Springfield.
Yeah. Hart's Location, that's the one I was trying to think of. Because Dixville Notch and Hart's Location, like, first of all, Dixville Notch is actually a great name. Hart's Location is like, you know, my mother is the youngest of 10 and everyone else has a first name and a middle name and she only has a first name. That's what it feels like when you named the place that you founded Hart's Location. And it's like Hart's, Hart, possessive S location. Like that's the location that Hart's at. Yep. All right. That's Hart's Location.
Mm-hmm. Isn't a hart an archaic word for like a stag or a deer of some kind?
But This is singular, so I don't know. It could be a person. It could be a place, a thing.
Well, it could be like the last place they saw that
oh, yeah,
stag,
the Hart's Location.
And that's Hart's Location. So I true story, in Costa Rica, there's a weird tradition. I know this because my friend Ron Bailey lived there for a long time. And then I remember reading about it in the Wall Street Journal. There's a weird tradition because street signs get blown away from storms and get stolen or whatever.
Like the one that destroyed my mailbox?
Very much, yes.
I have a whole saga that's continuing in that front, by the way.
Okay, well, not all my listeners, because I have so many more, are listeners of the Advisory Opinions podcast. So we'll bring them up to speed in a second. But the way they would do directions is like if you would ask, hey, where's the gas station? People would say with a totally straight face things like, oh, it's 3 miles past where the peach tree used to be. And I love that, right? It's sort of like it is a perfect way to filter out outsiders. You know? All right. So just so listeners know, you had a sign that was knocked over by the Leviathan State, and you were upset because you think it's essentially a taking.
Yeah, well, it is a taking. So first of all, they put up a temporary detour sign on my property, and I don't doubt that the county has some sort of easement for the part of my property that abuts the road. But, with great easement comes great responsibility. And they did not put sandbags on the bottom of this sign. It fell over into the street. They just put it back up with no additional weight. Then it fell over, decapitated my mailbox. Like, my mailbox has been eviscerated. It is gone. So actually, I called the 311 for our county. They were actually very, very kind. And they were like, that is assigned by the Virginia Department of Transportation. Here's their number. Here's how you file a claim, yada, yada. Great. Thank you. So we did that with the Virginia Department of Transportation. They wrote us back and said, we've looked into this. We are not responsible. Please contact Arlington County. Except, so first of all, they literally sent me the address for a building. That building doesn't have a phone number, no email address. There's no way to contact them, I suppose, except showing up, but I don't even know what building this is. But more to the point, I don't live in Arlington County. So that's weird. So did you look into my claim? Then, in the meantime, they put the sign back up and it's fallen over twice since, as they're claiming that they did nothing wrong. So I have sent them a strongly worded letter. My mailbox, the postman is now putting my mail in a upturned mailbox on the ground. That's where we are right now.
This is the kind of thing that destroys people. You become so obsessed.
I know.
That you can't let it go.
It's not going to turn out well. I can't.
You start being a bore at cocktail parties where people want to talk about
or on
all
podcasts.
Sorts of interesting things, or on podcasts, and you just can't. You're sort of like Elaine who can't get over how fascinating her stock options are in Seinfeld, and you just think that the weighty issues of your mailbox stuff is just so much more interesting than sort of Russia's invasion of Canada or whatever it is, and soon just no one wants to talk to you anymore.
I know, but it'll bring my husband and I closer because we will rant to each other about it. We now are trying to get footage of Bigfoot, meaning the Virginia Department of Transportation workers, putting the sign back up because now they're putting it back up every day. So what we need is video footage of this happening. So that's what we're working on now. So that means we just sit in our, staring out our front windows.
I rest my case.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, you're going to be some shut-ins, kids are going to ride their bikes up to the edge of your lawn. And why are those people just staring at a sign?
Yes.
All right. Before we lose even our last listener, we should probably talk of some sort of substance. I will say Advisory Opinions, which is our phenomenal niche legal podcast, which I listen to regularly, which surprises you, and which Steve doesn't, which surprises you as well. Helped inspire me to write my LA Times column this week, which I did on the Chevron deference thing. I know you guys claim this is your big issue over there, your weird little smoke-filled library of a podcast. But the degradation and corruption and entropy of Congress has been sort of what I've been banging my spoon on my high chair about for a very long time. And I kind of feel like you're eating off of my tray, as it were. And so, but your conversation about it, it's rare I encounter a new way to explain to people why Congress is broken. And I thought the conversation about the bad incentives that Chevron and related Brand X and these related things give was a useful thing. So why don't you you can only mention code once. Why don't you sort of explain what this is, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, I'm going to try to do the short version here, which is, when Congress passes a law, it is up to then the executive branch to figure out how that law is actually going to work and enforce that law. And you may think of enforcement being criminal, Congress says it's against the law to murder a postman, and then, the executive branch is aha, if you murder a postman, we will arrest you and put you on trial. But imagine all the regulatory stuff, right? Congress says you can't throw, your dirty whatever into the lake. Well, how's the executive branch going to enforce that? And so they have to come up with regulations to do that. And so the question is, how are courts supposed to interpret those regulations or the laws that those regulations are based on if there's wiggle room in what we're going to call ambiguity? So basically for a long time, including Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas, the two most conservative Supreme Court justices of maybe the history of the Supreme Court, both at various points said, well, the way you do that is you ask the agency that is coming up with the regulation or that came up with the regulation, what they think that ambiguity means or what it should mean. And as long as that's pretty reasonable and it makes some sense, that's fine. And we're going to defer to that, even if it's not the best reading of the statute or their own regulation, or even if they've switched their reading of their own regulation. Like they said it meant something else 2 years ago, and now they're coming back to court being like, JK, these exact same words that we told you 2 years ago mean this, and that you deferred to us on that now mean something totally different because the administration has changed. So this case is coming back up again. It's coming back up in that statutory context. So if Congress passes a law and it's ambiguous and the agency says it means X, do we go with the agency's interpretation, even if it's not the one we would otherwise go with, or do you just go with the sort of best reading of the words? Look, there are people who think that matters just because it matters, and that's fun. But I think the reason it really matters is because, and Jonah, you and I have talked about all the reasons that Congress has started to disintegrate as an institution, but there's a really good version of history in which case Chevron doctrine, this deference, is part of the reason that Congress has disintegrated as an institution. Because Congress passes a vague law that's sort of like, hey, you should really fix that thing, and then trails off. And now an agency gets to make a regulation about this. It's not really in Congress's interest to do much else at that point, because at any given time, half of Congress has control of the executive branch. Their party does. And so they don't need to compromise and go through sort of the messiness of legislation if they're going to get everything they want through agency regulation. And even better, that agency regulation itself doesn't matter because you can change how you interpret that regulation down the road. So the idea would be, if the Supreme Court says, no, we're not going to defer to agencies anymore, we're actually going to go with what Congress said, that it will certainly shrink the power of the administrative state to some degree. I think there are those who question how much it will really change the power of the administrative state, right? They're still the ones enforcing this regulation against you. They're still the one creating the regulation in the first place. So I actually sort of am with the people who are like, this may not change the administrative state that much at all. But the hope would be that it changes Congress quite a bit, because they actually will have an incentive to write the legislation more specifically and more exactly, because otherwise the courts are starting to say, we're not going to defer to the agency's interpretation of your statute. And this was a different case, but it's sort of related in context. And if there's, ambiguity in what Congress said, and it's over this major question, we're going to assume they didn't give the power to an agency. And so with all these things combined, the hope would be that the Supreme Court, through these various doctrines, is going to keep pushing the problems back on Congress instead of allowing the executive branch to take the heat for Congress, right? Because the executive branch is like, aha, we banned bump stocks yesterday, so now everyone can be happy about that. They put out a press release. The president gets that, bump, so to speak. Congress doesn't have to take a tough vote where, Republican members could get primaried for having an anti-Second Amendment vote. Yeah, the courts strike it down a few years later, but that headline's going to say conservative Supreme Court strikes down, gun control measure, instead of saying Congress had the power to do this the whole time, they just didn't do it. Or the president did something to save his party from having to take a hard vote. So through all of these, different types of cases, I feel like the media has missed the forest because they keep reporting on individual trees, and they have this memory of how conservatives hate big government. And so they only see it through that lens. And that's, again, sort of missing it, because government is not going to shrink because of any of this.
It reminds me, Ben Sass, I think on the second episode of The Remnant, made this point, that when he first came to Washington, the thing that surprised him most was the way in which most senators and congressmen now see themselves as lobbyists of the executive branch, insofar as he would ask people, why don't you write legislation on this 70-30 issue that's hugely popular in your state or your district? And the answer was, in effect, well, if I do that, then 30% of my state or my district is going to hate me. But if I lobby the White House to make this same change through some sort of regulatory or executive order, I get credit with the 70% and I don't get blame from the 30%. And that sort of, that's part of this incentive structure is that, and I thought you guys pointed to the Paul Clement, who was on the side of the plaintiffs in this case, who pointed out how like almost all the cases that are coming before the Supreme Court now are about regulatory rule stuff rather than statutory stuff because the Congress isn't producing any statutes. And anyway, so I think it's a good concrete example of how, it's sort of like, if you have a bad problem with your foot, eventually you can get like a back problem. There are these, or in certain ecosystems, you lose some really ugly, useless animal, but it turns out the really cool, charismatic megafauna depended on it 3 or 4 stages later as part of its food chain, and you lose that too. Little weird things.
My example, it's taking the wolves out of Yellowstone. When we reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, yada, 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 the beavers came back. Why? Mm-hmm. Because the, caribou elk population had gotten so out of control. They were eating all the greenery. That was then eroding the creek beds and river beds. And so then the beavers didn't have anywhere to build their dams. Anyway, so like the beavers came back. So yes, like ecosystems are odd and hard to pin down ahead of time before you make these kind of court-made doctrines like Chevron deference.
Right. Although, fun fact, in the 1990s, I remember I first thought that Chevron deference wasn't named after the gas company, the oil company Chevron. I assumed, and I think it was a kind of a reasonable assumption, that it was a legal standard about deferring to people with chevrons, which are like the military insignia on their sleeve. And it kind of fit in context. It's sort of like I thought the Huey Lewis song, I Want a New Drug, was I Want a New Truck for like 3 years, which didn't make as much sense in context, but it kind of worked.
No, I Want a New Truck makes no sense. Chevron deference being related to the shape Chevron versus the oil and gas company makes a lot of sense, actually.
I want a new truck. I want a new truck that makes me feel the way I feel when I'm with you. I mean, it plays. So I kind of agree with you. I don't think Congress is going to get its act together anytime soon, and changing this incentive structure will be a step in the right direction. But as long as we put Matt Gaetzes in Congress and AOCs and these kinds of people, you can't send subtle signals of do your job, right? Because they just have a different job description in their head. And, if you go back, I went back and I looked at this passage from my book about like Obamacare. There was something like 2,500 references to like the secretary shall, and half of them were may, or as deems necessary, and all that kind of stuff. Right? And so basically what you're doing is you are basically, what it does is it turns, I've been writing about how Americans think we live in a parliamentary democracy, and they're wrong for a long time. But this sort of adds another aspect to it, which is that, in a parliamentary democracy, once you elect a party, they just take over the government. They can do anything that they want. If under this sort of regime that we have now, you elect a presidential administration, they put 6,000 bureaucrats at the top of all these different agencies and departments, and Congress expects them to basically make the laws because they don't want to be in the lawmaking business that cuts into their morning Joe time.
So I think you hit on an important point here, which is for those who don't believe that this will make Congress do their job, I want to say yes and no. So I absolutely agree that you don't change the individual members of Congress who are there now. To your point, Matt Gaetz, AOC, right? It's sort of like, to borrow an analogy, when you actually look at cultural change in the country, whether it's race or sexual orientation and public opinion on it, for the most part, and this isn't entirely, 100%, but, and I think it'll be exactly the same in Congress, It's not that people change their minds. Some do, but a relatively small percentage. Do you know how cultural change happens in most places, including the United States, on these types of, sort of big questions?
Generational people die?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The people who thought one way die off, and a new group of people come up who believe something different. So that's sort of what I predict would happen with Congress. Some legislators are on the fence, right? If the incentive is to go on Morning Joe and raise money, or Fox and Friends, they'll do that. But they actually do sort of like the idea of legislating. And if that's the incentive, they'll start legislating. But I think the vast majority fall into one camp or the other. And the cable news pundit congressmen are not going to change who they are. That's not why they ran for Congress. It's also why you're seeing this, wave of retirements of what I'll call sort of the true legislators, the people who actually watched Mr. Smith Came to Washington and thought that looked like a fun thing to do. They're all leaving Congress because they're not getting to do that. So what's the point? If you actually want to make change in this country, you hear from a lot of members of Congress, this ain't the place to do it. So I'll go find somewhere else that can. So the idea would be that by the courts allowing some of these problems to fester and stagnate and refusing to allow the executive branch to just fix everything every time, that the problems will pile up and that voters will actually see that, Matt Gaetz on Fox and Friends or AOC on Morning Joe just keep talking about the problems, keep blaming someone else, but they don't propose legislation. AOC, the stat is accurate but misleading. AOC has no piece of legislation aside from renaming post offices and that type of thing. I'm talking about real legislation. No piece of real legislation that's moved at all. And that makes it sound like I'm, saying she's one of the least productive members of Congress. I mean, I guess she is, but it's like her and everyone else. When Jim Jordan was mentioned for Speaker of the House, and everyone was like, well, he's never had a piece of legislation, a major piece of legislation become a law. And it's like, yeah, him and everyone else, because that's not what Congress is doing right now. So the idea would be that voters would actually be the ones that the court is changing. And so it's maybe misleading even to say that the court will change the incentives in Congress, because really it will change the incentives for voters who will change then who's in Congress. And those Matt Gaetz AOCs will, quote unquote, die off, as in they won't be in Congress anymore.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic with that. It's very Burkean. As Burke said, I must bear with infirmities until they fester into crimes. And I got into a little bit of a spat with Chris Wallace on CNN because I was making a similar point, and he's like, "Yeah, but Congress doesn't do anything, so nothing's going to get done." And I was like, "Yeah,
yeah.
And until people get sick of that, but
immigration's a pretty interesting example of this, right? Immigration has been festering for a long time. And every time the executive does try to do something, for the most part, it hasn't worked particularly well. DAPA, which was for the parents of people brought here illegally, which is a little bit weird because it's generally the people who brought them here illegally. But anyway, that was struck down. The court said Obama did not have the power to do that. DACA, the actual Dreamer program, survived through Obama. Then they tried to repeal it during the Trump administration. The Supreme Court struck down, with John Roberts as the deciding vote, struck down the effort to repeal it because they hadn't, dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's in the Administrative Procedure Act. And so DACA kind of continues in this weird form where it's probably also not constitutional. But, the case sort of hasn't been able to be ripe enough because administrations keep messing with it. It seems to me that immigration is a big enough problem that everyone now across the political spectrum agrees is a huge, huge problem, and that the executive branch cannot fix it on their own. And the courts have said it's not the executive branch's job to fix it on their own. That was another case from last term where a bunch of states tried to sue Joe Biden because the statute says, shall not allow people to enter the United States illegally. And obviously that is happening. And the Supreme Court was like, with what money, Congress? We can't, squeeze water out of a stone. So yeah, you can't pass something that mandates the executive do something if you don't then give them the ability to do it. So here sits immigration. It will be a good experiment. It will be a really bad experiment. You know what I mean? To see whether the pressure will build so much on Congress that they actually do something? Or is it just such an effective campaign sloganeering issue where both sides keep blaming each other and winning elections by blaming the other side that voters are just okay with the fact that it feels really good to know that it's someone else's fault?
Yeah, but this sort of gets us, and this sort of gets what you're really here to talk about anyway. But it gets to this problem of the distortion effects, just like having a sore ankle can lead to a bad back, which is a worse problem than a sore ankle, or getting rid of the wolves can lead to, water, coastline erosion and soil erosion because the ecosystem's out of balance. Congressional dysfunction isn't the only mess that you create from screwing up by gumming up the works. At National Review, and I've given up trying to figure out who gets rights to say they coined this formulation because I've heard it from so many different people. But at National Review, we used to say all the time, if responsible politicians don't tackle the issue of immigration, irresponsible ones will. Donald Trump really was the sort of perfect manifestation of that, right? Is like if you don't treat it as a real issue and treat people's concerns with it in a responsible and serious way, then you are just opening up a path for a demagogue to come in and tackle it and grab a whole bunch of people who otherwise wouldn't support you, but for the fact that they're so pissed off about immigration. And so the festering by Congress created opportunities for Donald Trump to come along and talk about banning Muslims and make Mexico pay for a wall and all of these kinds of things and make the fences really pointy so they hurt people and all this stuff. And so I agree with you. Really the only choice here is to sort of keep kicking the engine until it does what it's supposed to do. But there are real risks that something else is going to fall off before it starts going chapakata and working again.
That's a great onomatopoeia.
Which I am nothing if not onomatopoetical. Which brings us sort of in a roundabout way to the thing I lured you like a stranger with candy in a van into coming on this podcast in the first place, which was we were supposed to do this in the skiff. We had an argument on the Dispatch podcast at the end of last week where you took a little bit of a straw man-y position in saying that Americans never cared about policy, or Republicans never cared about policy at all.
Oh, no, Americans
don't care about policy. Okay. And so why don't you state your belief and then I will tell you where you're wrong.
Okay, I'll give the big version and then I'll nuance it just a little. You're right, I intentionally didn't do on the podcast because I was trying to make a big point. I wanted to see where you guys would fall on it. So here's the big position. Voters, and I don't just mean Americans, but I think it's much, much easier if we talk only about America because I don't know much about other countries. But voters in a constitutional republic are supposed to be voting on issues, and therefore we poll them on issues. They will talk to you about issues. They'll have sometimes even pretty sophisticated things to say about issues. But that in the end, that's not actually how they're voting or why they're voting the way that they're voting. And instead, it's a much more lizard brain evolutionary drive in terms of how we think about our leaders. And that constitutional republics just have this like policy veneer over that. And let me nuance it a little, which is to say, of course, some people care about policy. There's nothing in the world that is all one thing or all the other thing. However, I think we can see in real time in our lifetime in a way that most Americans have not had the pleasure of seeing, as the two parties are realigning so quickly and those tectonic plates are shifting so fast, arguably, faster than any party realignment, although we can point to maybe some that were also very large, that policies are shifting around that political realignment also very quickly. And yet, the vast majority of voters are actually staying with the party that they originally came with. So the theory would be something like, this is proof that therefore those voters were not driven by policy. They were driven by tribalism, and that would explain how you follow the party. But as the parties fall apart, it hasn't really affected much either. In that case, it's far more personality driven. It's why you see major changes to political parties every time there's a new nominee for president. The vibe of the party can change, the policies of the party can change, or like with the Republican Party, they ditch the party platform entirely. That is not good evidence that policy matters. And I would argue it never did. And so when you look at someone like Ronald Reagan as, oh, well, the three legs of the stool and all of this stuff, I think there's just this alternative version of history of like, no, Ronald Reagan appealed to people the same way that Donald Trump does, the same way that Barack Obama did, the same way that FDR did. This was a person that people wanted to follow. They have natural charisma, natural leadership ability, and the policies were what allowed people to talk about that in a way that wasn't just me like strongman.
Okay, so obviously there is some truth to what you're saying, because there always is, right? I mean, it's sort of like, why does the taller president almost always win? You know, in like
policy, Jonah. Obviously, the taller guy just has better policy positions.
I am conceding that there is some truth to what you're saying.
Okay.
Where I think you're sitting there in your wrongness is to think that the lizard brain, we'll just call it the lizard brain stuff, right? Strength, all that kind of stuff, charisma, usually the more handsome candidate wins. That is really what's driving the bulk of people. I think the lizard brain stuff is always a factor, but it doesn't trump all the other factors until recently. And I think that's the thing. I think you talked earlier about how these younger people come along, they grew up under a different environment, and so that's how you get sort of cultural change is just by, you know, the olds going out Logan's Run style. I agree with you on that. And I think the problem is that you as a youngin', a wee lass, you've grown up more at a time when these things are where the lizard brain stuff is more explanatory than it was in the past. Clearly, like prior to mass media has been a great aider and abetter of the triumph of the lizard brain, right? Before
in all
TV,
sorts of facets. Yeah.
All sorts of ways. I mean, TV, radio, social media, all that, right? And like Abraham Lincoln, not a great looking dude. Issues were kind of important in Lincoln's campaign.
I don't know. Like, so I was just...
You don't think the abolition movement cared about policy?
So, yes, the abolition movement cared about policy. However, Lincoln was not the head of the abolition movement. A really good-looking dude said, hey, we should keep slaves. And they're like, oh, all right. But it's funny because as you were talking, I was like, okay, I think my next thing I want to dive into Lincoln and Douglas. And then you were like, Lincoln. And I was like, perfect. Because I do think that's an interesting example. They're traveling around the country. And now, yes, I know that the Lincoln-Douglas debates were about the Senate race, but it wasn't, right? It was both. It really was, there was a reason It
was like the DeSantis-Newsom debate on Fox.
Exactly. Yes. Right. That's the perfect analogy. Like everyone knew what it was actually about at the time, even though it was about a Senate race. So, yes, they are debating the future of the country, slave or free. And by the way, both taking fairly nuanced positions in that. Meaning, again, Lincoln
nuanced positions on either side of a very unnuanced question, right?
So correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, but my point is, Lincoln was not the head of the abolition movement. And when you fast forward then to 1860, there's 4 people running for president. So it's messy no matter what, in the sense that, yep, I agree with you that Lincoln was not a good-looking guy. His voice was, from what we know, high-pitched and not... it was not Sam Waterston. Oh, Sam Waterston. I mean, talk about a childhood crush, by the way. I just can't even tell you how inappropriate my thoughts are about Sam Waterston when I was young. Maybe now, whatever. The old Glory Insurance ad from Saturday Night Live, when the robots come from you, when the robots come for you. So good.
Do you need a minute? You like to compose yourself?
Yeah, I might. So then let's talk about that, which is, I hear you that for a lot of people in the country, they said that they were voting on the slavery question. I don't doubt that some truly were, but I guess my point to you would be maybe not as many as you think, meaning, maybe for a lot of people it was. And remember, back then, of course, the parties are going to be much stronger. The president's going to be a much, much weaker position. So it's not totally the same in terms of what you think you're voting for even now. But something to the effect of, look, all of these Northern people say they are against slavery. Give me a break. If they were born in the South and their economic interests were tied up in slavery, you think they'd all be against slavery still? Like, no, it wasn't inherent to their character, and it just happened to divide along the Mason-Dixon line. There was something clearly much different and maybe more fundamental going on than simply the policy question. Or else, I don't think you'd find it ridiculous that, like, no, these types of people actually were against slavery and these types of people were for it, not just based around, where they lived.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. But, I mean, there's reasons why, Vermont abolishes slavery like day one of independence or something like that. I mean, they do it
because they don't need it. They don't even have it. Like, they abolished something they didn't have. I abolished crack cocaine in my house. Good for me.
Yeah. You are venturing very close to vulgar Marxism on all of this. And the idea that there aren't ideological precepts that inform political culture, I think, is one that you don't want to take a hard defense of, because the Americans are weird, right? And this is like, I've done this. I do this a lot. Take out your bingo cards. But Marty Lipset, his great example of how the greatest political natural experiment in politics wasn't North Korea versus South Korea or West Germany versus East Germany. It was the United States versus Canada. Insofar as the Canadian provinces stayed loyalist and royalist, and if you had your head and your heart wired for some full tilt boogie for freedom and justice, as Tommy Lee Jones says in Firebirds, and you lived up there, you moved down to one of the 13 colonies to open a can of whoop ass on King George. If you were a loyalist or a royalist in the 13 colonies, you moved up to Canada or you went home, right? And so 200 years later, when the United States and Canada, pretty much at the same time, tell Americans and Canadians were switching to the metric system, the Canadians are like, okay. And they all just start speaking in that gibberish. And Americans are like, screw you, that's witchcraft. We want nothing to do with it, right? There is an American character that is, it may not be strictly speaking policy driven in some sort of abstract sense, but there are cultural differences between people that do inform their policy preferences in all sorts of ways.
Oh, no, we're wildly agreeing. Because, yes, I agree. Because that's a self-selection, lizard brain thing. Same way Australia's full of criminals. America's full of entrepreneurs. And Canada's full of people who follow rules. Because it was self-selection, although, in Australia, it was self-selected on their behalf.
Right. Self-selection versus selected.
Yeah. But America is actually the best example of this because of immigration and, the types of people who are looking around and being like, you know what? There are not enough potatoes for all of us. How is this going to work out? Some people were like, I don't know. It'll probably work out. I'll stay here and hope for the right amount of potatoes. And then some people were like, you know what? I have no idea what's waiting for me, but it's got to be better than this. And that sort of, whether you want to call it optimism, foolhardiness, risk tolerance. I mean, my God, America's nothing if not risk tolerant. But that is different. That sort of lizard brain character stuff is different than a 10-point plan to save Social Security.
No, I agree with that. And I think you made and I don't think we're going, I mean, look, I think you can't look at the Cold War. You can't look at the issues like the Vietnam War without taking into account that some people actually do have coherent views on policies and they vote that way. But
Absolutely.
We're not going to bridge that divide. And I want to pick up on a point that I think you brought me over to your side.
Okay, I want to agree with you on one thing, though, because clearly there is a percentage of people who vote on policy, or else there would not be Republicans who left the Republican Party after Donald Trump. But that number appears to be around 5%.
Yeah.
Of the Republicans. So if we assume the Democrats are about the same, I would venture to say between 10 and 15% of Americans vote on policy.
Yeah, but you're kind of like a border collie pushing me into your position here, because like I will disagree with you a little bit on this. I think most of the people who left the Republican Party because of Donald Trump probably did not do it because of policy. They did it because he's a short-fingered vulgarian and they're disgusted by him.
Oh my, you have a point that their lizard brains are just differently wired. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there's an element of disgust that comes first with Trump, and an element of anger of feeling like you're made to be a fool for not buying the con, and that arouses resentment. And I think then people look at the substance and that follows on. But you said a minute ago about when you were talking about Lincoln, when you were expanding on your wrongness about how slavery wasn't an important policy issue in elections.
I'm
kidding. You made this point, which I will always gravitate towards, about how the parties were stronger back then. And I think one way to reconcile our positions is that stakeholders care about policy more than the average person, right?
Yes.
And which is one of the reasons why, which we're not going to go back to, I'm not advocating for it, but it used to be, that was part of the original argument going back to the 17th and 18th century in Europe and also the United States about land owning or property owning is a requirement for voting. Was this idea that you needed to have skin in the game, you needed to have a sort of yeoman fiduciary conception of your responsibilities as a citizen, and yada, yada, yada. The Greeks had this distinction between citizens and I'm not making this up, idiots, because the original meaning of the word idiot meant someone, it doesn't mean you were dumb, it meant you were not a participant in the civic life, right? And if you weren't going to participate, you shouldn't get to vote. If you weren't going to engage and take it seriously, get out of the way. And I think that parties are there to organize coherent policy programs, and they organize institutions and stakeholders who are like-minded about their interests around a coherent policy program, and then they go work on the voters. And so one of the reasons why I think you're wrong about the past, but more wrong about the past, but more correct about the present, is because of the weak parties and because of the role of mass media works. The stakeholders at almost every level, institutional and individual, they become afterthoughts, because if you can rally the mob, you can rally the masses to the banner, then the business interests are just going to go along and take the least worst option, and the party has no power. Institutions that I care deeply about have very little power, both in conservative media and elsewhere. And so the people who care about issues rather than driving politics are being pulled by its undertow. Does that make sense? By the lizard brain people.
That makes so much sense. And as you have come to me a bit, I will come to you a bit as well and say, I think I probably buy into that pretty fully, as long as we acknowledge that even the stakeholders may overcome their lizard brain in the sense that, like, no, your economic interest is clearly X, and you have an outsized vote, so to speak, in all of this. But that a lot of those stakeholders are still lizard brain driven by just slightly different lizard brain stuff. Power for themselves instead of the power for this other person they're voting for, stuff like that. That I guess my overall thing is that, like, the policy itself really just isn't the driver for most people and most things, because just sort of the same way that human brains don't work on data, even though they should, they work on anecdote. We can keep throwing data at people and we can say that we then respond to the data. But even then, we're more likely responding to the anecdote and are then telling ourselves that we're responding to the data.
Yeah, but you are subtly shifting your position here.
No, I am, because you've convinced me a little.
So the question wasn't whether policy drives everything; it was whether voters care at all about it, which is a little different. But
and let me be clear. My original point was that voters will say that they care about it. Voters think that they care about it. but that they in fact do not.
Did you see this Rasmussen poll about elites?
Gotta give me a little more than that.
Not the bad Rasmussen, the Rasmussen who left Rasmussen and started another polling firm. They talked about it endlessly on the podcast, on the commentary podcast the other day. It's really interesting. I think it's really flawed, but it's really interesting insofar as it. What's her name? The columnist at the Wall Street Journal,
Kim Strassel.
She had an interesting column on this about the us versus them thing, election. And anyway, they define elite for the purposes of this poll as anyone who lives in a densely populated place and whose household makes more than $150,000 a year. And I get it. That's definitely capturing a real demographic. Oh, and have postgraduate degrees. Okay, so that's a real demographic. It's important and it's valuable, and and the things that they believe are crazy town bonkers. Like 70% of them are for like rationing air travel and meat consumption and all of this kind of stuff to fight climate change. I mean, it's really kind of insane and fits all these stereotypes. I think they made an incredibly big mistake in calling them elites because there was this huge opportunity to coin sort of like soccer mom or security dad, whatever it is, like one of these demographics that people could talk about without people contesting what your definition is. But when you just call it elite, you're leaving out a lot of people who don't think that way. $150,000 a year is a lot of money for a lot of Americans. But if we're going to talk about the people that we generally refer to as the 1%, it's not them, right? It's
if you make $150,000 in New York City, you're pretty poor.
You could be struggling for sure. You're not, an elite. But like, what's interesting is the people in this cohort, they are happier with their life. They feel like they've benefited from the Biden economy. And anyway, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, but there's also a lot of stuff that some stolen bases. But I just wanted to put your attention to it.
So, what's interesting though, by making it as low as $150,000, though, what I think my guess is they're trying to include is the people who almost fit their stereotype that they were looking for better, because those are people who got postgraduate degrees then and did not go to try to make money. They went into academia, they went into nonprofit sectors or public service sectors of some kind. And you almost then, you could have capped the amount too. And I bet the statistics would have gotten even crazier, because then you're looking at a very weird cohort that went to get postgraduate degrees that are, not MBAs, JDs, things like that, because those people aren't going to make that amount of money. You're looking at people who got graduate degrees. Did you say postdoc or just, no, sorry, not postdoc, but just post-undergrad?
I post-grad means post-bachelor, right? I mean, like after...
Okay. Yeah, so like a master's in public policy or in social work or anything like that is going to count.
Right.
And you're right, I wouldn't call that... I would call that the NIMBY class before I'd call it anything else.
There are all sorts of labels you could put to it that I think would be clarifying rather than obscuring. And, in New York City and LA County, I believe that if you get a master's in education and you jigger your resume just the right way, your household, particularly if you have two high school teachers in it, you're going to soar past that 150,000. And to talk about those people as if they're elites, I just think is distorting. But yeah, for sure, urban coastal America, with which you can include in the coast of Lake Michigan and a couple other places, those people think differently than average Americans, and I think it's all interesting. But it's
if you wanted to, like, I would also then be interested, do the other cohort of that genre, which is only people, and this is why it would be hard, because you'd have to actually get them to answer polls and stuff like that, which might tell you that they're elites. JD, MBA, MDs who make over $1 million a year. And then you don't need to do the urban thing. Just over $1 million, and you have one of those 3 degrees. Now ask those same questions of what they believe, and I think it will look very, very different than, again, what I'm going to call the NIMBY class of social workers. And I don't mean literal people who do social work, but social work.
But the reason why this came into my brain when you were talking about it is that when you talked about how people say they care about policy, the social desirability bias of this cohort is massive.
Yeah.
And the idea that they're willing to say, someone in Park Slope, from a $500,000 a year family, one's a lawyer, one's a college instructor or something like that, that they're in favor of restricting air travel and care very little bit about personal freedom and all this kind of stuff. Maybe they think that, maybe they don't, but my hunch is the first time you tell them that they can't go on their vacation to Cabo because they're fighting climate change, they will turn into whirling dervishes of Karen at the airport, right?
That's why I called them the NIMBY class, because this is exactly the group that you see over and over again saying that they believe one thing as long as it doesn't affect their lives.
Right. They have luxury beliefs.
Yeah, and housing development stuff. And I do mean it in that. I mean, that is exactly the NIMBY class that you're seeing in California often, although it goes up in income quite a bit as well. But I mean NIMBY across all things. Climate change,
So where I live, but we don't have to get too specific about it. Corner of Northwest Washington. And my wife and I have been calling it the coalition against everything for a long time because, they just straight up, you tell them, you say, okay, there's a chance a really good restaurant's going to move in the neighborhood. And they're like, no, we're against it. There's a place that can cure cancer, but it's going to require, there's going to be some parking issues. No, can't have it. And it's a huge, there are professional NIMBYers in DC who just immediately sign petitions to stop rumors of people having fun someplace.
You read the story about the pickleball wars, right?
Yeah.
Raging in DC.
Are you pro or anti pickleball?
I don't have strong feelings either way. It is a little bit more sympathetic to me that pickleball is very noisy and that these people have taken over parks that did not have noisy games being played in them and now play noisy games. But it cracks me up that it's, 50-year-olds playing the noisy games and then the 70-year-olds in the nearby house are yelling at the kids.
We have tennis courts near me. I don't play tennis. But if people are so mad about pickleball, I will go start playing tennis. And the amount of groaning and screaming that I will provide will make people yearn for the euphonious sound of pickleball once again. It'll sound like there's an abattoir right outside their window.
The same thing happened with that dog park in Chevy Chase. They were like, the NIMBYs were mad that dogs are dogs. And it was like, guys, you just get over that.
Don't get me started on anti-dog park stuff. I get it to a certain extent, but there are places, there are definitely places like no dogs in a playground, period. Just can't have dogs. And most playgrounds now have a fence around them, and it's just zero tolerance for it, both for the dog's sake and for the kid's sake. It's bad for social peace. But there's nothing wrong with having areas that are just for dogs. And having spent a lot of time in the Kalorama and the Adams Morgan Dog Park, the people who use those dog parks most regularly are two groups: parents and nannies with little kids and dog owners. And those are the only two groups that I think have a sort of a proprietary interest in the use of, depends on the park, obviously, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I have strong views about this, which we don't want to get into because no one really cares. But Adam says that people care. So we might publish this early, and we haven't done any punditry or prognostication of any kind. So in part because I don't think it's all that interesting anymore. If Haley, tell me where I'm wrong. If Haley wins, it's that's a big deal. She lives to fight another day, but she'll probably still end up losing. If Haley loses tonight in New Hampshire, she may not drop out tomorrow or the next day, but odds of her contesting South Carolina are unlikely, and she would probably lose in South Carolina. And so, barring some really shocking result tonight, I think we agree that it's not all over, but it's wrapping up, and the trajectory is pretty obvious.
So there's the pundit version that we live in today, and I think everything you just said is accurate for the pundit world of humans who live about 85 years on the planet. I think in a historical sense, in a larger sense, they will say that there were two incumbents running in this election and there was no primary.
I basically think that's
that maybe there could have been, but there wasn't. Yeah. So yeah, there was no primary.
And this is sort of my I wrote about this in a bad G-file last week, but like, obviously I am dismayed by what's happened to the Republican Party. I find it very difficult to even notionally call myself a Republican, given the givens these days.
At least it wasn't your career, man.
Hey, we do is we can just sort of like sit around like Richard Dreyfuss and what's it, Robert Shaw in Jaws and compare shark scars about all this kind of stuff. I got that beat. But I think the talk about how it's a completely MAGA party overstates things in this regard. If Trump is in fact running as a de facto incumbent, talk about lanes and factions means less. Doesn't mean nothing, but it means less because parties rally around incumbents regardless. You know, the Buchananites rallied around George H.W. Bush. I mean, the parties come home around incumbents, come home around standard bearers, even if they have disagreements. And I think the really dyspeptic, it's all a Trump party stuff now is slightly overstated, but it's sufficiently accurate to make me start cutting myself again.
Well, wait, because you just said two things that I think were totally contradictory. And maybe it goes back to our previous conversation on policy.
I think it's overstated. Look, you can't exaggerate a truth, right? You can't exaggerate a lie, right? I mean, like you can only exaggerate truths, and it's an exaggeration to say it's a fully magnified Trump party, but it's sufficiently true to make me depressed. That's all I'm saying. No, doesn't make sense to you?
Yeah, but my point is, I don't know what MAGA means if it doesn't mean a party that rallies around Donald Trump regardless of policy.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's fair.
Yep, he's an incumbent, therefore they're rallying around him, therefore it's a MAGA party. Like, that's all the same thing.
Let me put it this way. I think if Trump was running for the first time this time, not everybody who's voting for him now would, right? Like there are people who are holding their nose and rallying around him because he's the de facto incumbent. They're not. We both agree that the Bragg indictment was bad and helped Trump. The people who were for Trump before the Bragg indictment, that is the MAGA faction in the Republican Party. The people who rallied to Trump only after he was indicted, that's people rallying around the standard bearer, the de facto incumbent. Does that distinction make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty small point you're making. I don't disagree with it, I think, but it's, yes, that he's an incumbent, and therefore the people who view themselves as being part of that, Republican side will and have rallied around the incumbent. Some of them might have been willing to consider someone else, and if there hadn't been an incumbent, there would have been a primary, which is sort of like a duh.
Fair. Okay, fine. So how do you feel? Let me just for some prognostication now. When do you think Nikki Haley gets out?
Pretty soon.
Who do you think Donald Trump picks as his running mate?
Betting right now, definitely Elise Stefanik. I've been saying that for about 2 months. I think that there are some distant choices well below her, but I think it's Elise Stefanik's to lose. But I'll tell you how I think she can lose it, which is Donald Trump's thing. I have this theory that if you have dad issues, you're like a stripper or you're an alcoholic or you have pretty run-of-the-mill social problems, maybe. If you have mom issues, though, that's where you like wear the skin suit and stuff like that. So Donald Trump's mother issues, whatever they may be, his whole thing is getting people to pick him over the thing that they hold most dear or that they think they hold most dear and poking them and poking them and poking them. And so what happens, you can like sort of re-look at the whole first Trump term as him taking all of these people who were, pillars of the Republican Party and like testing their priorities, wanting to make sure that he was always their priority. And with a few notable exceptions, everyone failed. They actually did, in the end, all pick something other than Donald Trump. Bill Barr, Jeff Sessions, run through John Kelly. I don't know, like keep going through the list. So Mike Pence, of course, is the most important example. He wants to prevent having another Mike Pence. But at the same time, that's the whole point. He doesn't want people who he knows don't have any other priorities, don't have any sort of character that he can break. So that puts Elise Stefanik in an interesting tightrope. He wants someone who will pick him in the end. He needs someone who will pick him in the end. But he also has to have someone who there's a tension there about whether they will pick him in the end. I think Elise Stefanik definitely fits that right now. She could fall, though, off that tightrope on either side into the net. But Tim Scott, for instance, I think is on the list, certainly, but I think he's pretty far down. Sarah Sanders, I think, is on the list, but also further down. Kristi Noem and those type people, not really. You know, I heard someone say Doug Burgum because he likes rich white guys. Like, kind of he does, but not in that way. So, I don't know. I've given you more of my philosophical statements on how I think the VP will be picked.
Yeah, so I like this lizard brain analysis of Trump. I agree with you that it's definitely a thing with him, right? Is that it is, and I think it's hilarious that he is now using the phrase bend the knee, which is what a lot of us used sarcastically, you know, at the end of the Game of Thrones era to describe people who humiliated themselves by supplicating to him. But it's an impossible thing for me to talk about without risking my feminist ally status and being accused of lookism and sexism and all that.
I think you're wrong about that. I know what you're going to say, and I think that also misses a little bit of the Trumpness. Yes, he cares very much what people look like on TV, but not necessarily that they're attractive. They just have to look the correct part.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. That said, there is a reason why Donald Trump has finally settled on the lawyer that he wants, which is this Haba woman, right? Who is basically a body double for Melania for lighting purposes. And
yes, but in a case he wants to lose, Jonah, he doesn't actually want to win that case.
For a very attractive woman, she's a good lawyer.
Wait a second.
Yeah, okay. But fair. But he also likes to be seen alongside. I've seen him alongside her more than any other lawyer, right? I mean, he wants her in the shot. I don't know that he wants Elise Stefanik in the shot the way, but you could be right. I mean, like,
I'm right.
Like these other psychological things could be of higher priority for him. But I also just like, there's not a lot of pride to take in at this point in breaking Elise Stefanik. She's broken, right? I mean, like, there's no trophy for getting her to humiliate herself because she's been doing it for so long.
Well, couldn't you have said the same thing about Mike Pence? And yet there was, or there would have been.
Yeah, but the Mike Pence thing also had factors that are no longer factors, which is that he picked Mike Pence because he needed a faction of the GOP to come on over. There is no faction of the GOP that he needs to come on over because he's stolen their vote, their rank and file. And Pence did endorse Cruz, you know, in the primaries. So there was an added sort of humiliation bonus. But
by the way, I think Ted Cruz as Attorney General is also a very likely pick, given all of the factors that I just laid out as well. You know, because people are out there saying like, oh, it's going to be Stephen Miller or, you know, sort of the like, you know, John Eastman or Jeff Clark. Like, nope. Trump actually really cares about the baseball card and about someone being, I don't know, a collectible item. Like a U.S. senator who ran for president is a collectible
from the right
item.
Schools.
Yes,
he loves to
Harvard,
yeah.
Princeton, all of that stuff. You know, Jeff Clark, like absolutely not.
Also, as we've talked about before, the Senate could confirm Cruz because they want him out of the Senate.
It's the Teddy Roosevelt theory of attorney generaling.
You can get 30 Democratic votes for him as AG. And all right, so how are you feeling right now about who wins, Biden versus Trump?
Yeah. So there's this thing written on the back of our money that translates to God favors our undertakings. And sometimes I just read that and, you know, trust in my higher power.
Well, we can talk about this more from our group house in New Zealand.
That's right. I mean, right now, I think it's Trump. That so much can change, though. That's why I think this is really hard, because there is a world in which if Trump is really up by 8 in Michigan, 8 in Georgia, and it's July. Maybe there is a world, if it's looking like a blowout, that Joe Biden moves aside or something and they put in Gretchen Whitmer. And by they put in, there's this nobody seems to understand how this would actually happen. And the very short version is, right, the DNC and the RNC members can vote on who their nominee is. That's what the conventions are actually for. So after the nominee has been selected, but before ballots have been printed, that's sort of that sweet window where DNC members and RNC members are at the zenith of their power. Now, once ballots have been printed, things get really weird. You're then looking at state law. At some point, you end up in the 20th Amendment. If the president is not qualified, that could mean dead or whatever else. It goes to the vice president who's qualified. Things happen. But that being said, remember what happened in 2016? It did look like a blowout for Hillary Clinton. The Republicans thought about replacing Trump on the ticket. They didn't not replace him because they thought there was a chance he would win. They didn't replace him because they thought it would actually be better for the party to lose in 2016 because they thought they could just win in 2020. Nobody at the RNC, and believe me, I talked to all of them in the run up to it because they were looking for jobs. None of them thought that Trump was going to win at that point. They just thought it would be too catastrophic to replace him. Voters would be too angry with them, and that person wouldn't win either, right? So there wasn't really a winning option. So even if Biden is losing by a lot, I still think that it's very, very unlikely that the Democratic Party thinks that their replacement could win. And if they aren't very, very certain that the replacement can win, they're going to allow Trump to win rather than lose and anger their voters.
Buy gold. Sarah Isgur, thank you so much for doing this. I know you got to go. And we will save our dating advice conversation for another time. We got a remarkably large amount of positive reactions to that, which I find baffling, but so be it.
You should not be taking dating advice from Jonah and I, except to say that I think we're both very happy, oddly. You don't seem like a happy person. People wouldn't know that you're a happy person, except that they're Remnant listeners, and maybe they actually can figure out that you're a deeply happy person. You pretend to be a curmudgeon, and you have curmudgeon-like aspects. But in fact, there's nothing curmudgeonly about you. And that, I think, is because of Jessica. I think you would be a curmudgeon.
We will have this conversation anon. No. I am generally a happy person.
I have one for you that I want to table also, though. Crying in the workplace.
Interesting. Context? I mean, if you're yelled at by your boss and you cry?
Yeah. As in, it is work-related crying or work-adjacent related crying.
Okay, not like you got a call and your dog was killed by a car, when you cry. That's not the kind of crying you're talking about.
No, not that crying. No, your boss says, your memo is not even good enough for me to have spent the time to read it. How dare you, whatever. And
gotcha.
You well up.
I want to talk about that. That's a good one. We will call that episode Occupational Lacrimosity.
Just for those who aren't sure what a nerd you are. They haven't been listening to the Remnant this whole time. They weren't sure. And now they can be certain.
Click. It all comes into focus. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jonah.
Okay, so Sarah has left the studio on the assumption, and I could be wrong, that people out there are bored because there's no results yet until later tonight. We're going to release this podcast today, so you have something to listen to before the results come in. Obviously, though I know we both sounded sort of despairing and dyspeptic. Obviously, I hope Nikki Haley wins in New Hampshire in a blowout. I hope that she then goes on to win South Carolina, goes on to become the nominee, defeats Joe Biden. That would be great. But I care more about defeating Donald Trump than defeating Joe Biden at this point. But, just intellectual honesty. There are some people who think I should be more of a cheerleader for the outcomes that I want in life. And that's just sort of not the life I've chosen. But I'm honest about my priors. I just don't think I don't think that's likely to happen. And so this is one of the perils of recording on a primary day that matters so much. But on the assumption that people want something to listen to while they're just cooling their jets and there's nothing new on TV for a while, we're going to release this today. This is one of the two conversation remnants this week. So they'll skip a day, and then the second one, which I'll record on Wednesday, will come out, I guess, Thursday, and then there'll be the solo, and we'll know a lot more about what things look like, I think, by the time I record the solo. And thanks again to Sarah. We're going to have another Half-Baked Ideas podcast coming up. I'm not sure the exact date, but I've been talking to Representative Gallagher about it. And my larder of half-baked ideas is kind of spare right now. So if you have any, send them my way. You can just email the remnant@thedispatch.com or remnant@thedispatch.com. Either one works. And just put half-baked idea in the subject header. And other than that, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.